A cultura é um dos mais preciosos instrumentos de democracia. É um canal de expressão plural que permite a convivência de diferentes vozes, histórias e visões de mundo. E por isso a cultura, tal qual a democracia, deve ser defendida e fortalecida. Essa é a função da Lei Rouanet, a principal política pública de incentivo à cultura brasileira. Com ela, perseguimos a missão de assegurar o acesso democrático à produção e à difusão cultural. Ao longo de mais de 3 décadas, a Rouanet permitiu que inúmeras iniciativas culturais, antes inviáveis, ganhassem o mundo. Revelou histórias, preservou tradições e transformou vidas. Lei Rouanet, há 33 anos, tornando a cultura brasileira mais plural, acessível e democrática.
Casal de dançarinos se olham sorridentes. Uma banda orquestrada para de tocar. Logos: Lei Rouanet, Ministério da Cultura, Governo Federal, Brasil, União e Reconstrução.
Onde tem cultura, a Vale está. No poder criativo que nasce dos palcos, orquestras, das artes, das ruas e dos museus. Na valorização das diversas identidades brasileiras e na preservação de memórias. É valorizando a cultura que crescemos e evoluímos juntos. Instituto Cultural Vale.
Ministério da Cultura e a Associação Casa Azul apresentam 23ª FLIP, Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. A FLIP conta com o benefício da Lei Federal de Incentivo à Cultura, Lei Rouanet, PRONAC 235060, e possui acessibilidade para pessoas com deficiências física, visual e auditiva. Tem patrocínio Jequitibá do Nubank. Patrocínio Figueira da Vale. Patrocínio Guapuruvu do Itaú e da Motiva, por meio do seu instituto. Patrocínio Cedro do Sesc, da MAC Móveis e de O Globo. Patrocínio Araribá, da Globo Livros. Apoio institucional da Prefeitura de Paraty, Governo do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, IFAM, Instituto do Patrimônio Histórico e Artístico Nacional e Museu do Território. É uma criação e realização Associação Casa Azul e Ministério da Cultura, Governo Federal, Brasil, União e Reconstrução. FLIP, o encontro da literatura com a cidade.
Para mim, não tenho palavra para descrever a importância das abelhas na minha vida e vice-versa. Eu tiro abelhas de teto de casa, de ocos de pedra, buraco no chão, de toco de árvore e coloco naquelas caixas padronizadas. Então as abelhas facilitam muito o seu trabalho. Essa é a importância do apicultor com as abelhas. Um protetor, né? A gente cuida protegendo. E a questão do benefício na natureza como um todo, a polinização, esse preto é própolis, a produção de mel, pólen, geleia real, própolis. Até um pouquinho de mel ali, ó. Eu me entendi por gente apaixonando por abelha. E a minha primeira colmeia que eu instalei, as duas primeiras, tinha 11 anos de idade. Continuo sendo apaixonado. Espero que até os 100 anos vou fazer isso.
Reached our third roundtable, and before that I'm going to do some housekeeping. You can send us questions. There is a paper being distributed inside the room and outside, and then you can sign your extraordinary books back out there at the bookstore. And we named this roundtable the Extraordinary Common Life or Ordinary Life because it is about books that tell us the story of ordinary people, but they make us wish to go back into the books to spend more time with them. And I would like to seize the occasion to thank all of the technicians from Carlão Zadacio and others that are taking care of everything of the audio and the mics and many other things. Thank you very much. As moderator, I invite Gabriela Maia, who is a journalist and a literary critic, and it is a voice that wakes me up every day during my breakfast time, and it is someone very interesting and very interested in literature. Gabriela. Good evening, everyone. Wow, that's a full house. Well, I'm going to, without further ado, invite Sandro Veronesi and Pedro Guerra to the stage. So, hello everyone and good evening. It is a great pleasure and a great joy to be here, and I would like to thank the organization for the invitation, thanking Anna and the Flip team, the translators who we were talking to a moment ago. This is very important, and I will very briefly introduce our guests. And the idea is that later they are going to read an excerpt from their books right in the beginning, because we thought it would be a nice way for everyone to get to know their books and a little bit more of the stories. Sandro Veronesi was born in Florence in Italy in 1959, but he says that he considers to be born in Prato, a smaller village close to the place where he was born. He authored over 20 books, and he also won many literary awards, including the prestigious Strega Award from Italy twice. First for the novel Quiet Chaos, translated into Portuguese by Gabriela Bogossian, published by Rocco Publishing House in 2007. And it is going to be published again by another publishing house who is publishing Veronesi's works in Brazil. And then he won the Strega again with The Hummingbird, translated by Karine Janina, published by Authentica Contemporanea in 2024. And his most recent romance is Dark September, also published by the same publishing house. Pedro Guerra was born in Fortaleza, Ceará in 76, living in São Paulo nowadays, and he is the author of Avenida Molotov, published by Kelon in 2018. And he is also the author of the greatest living human being, o maior ser humano vivo, published by Record. And Pedro, we decided that you were going to start reading your excerpt. No? No. Okay, you first, Pedro. I just leave to introduce you to what's happening in the book. The main character is an extremely ambitious lawyer, like very close to being crazy for his ambitions. And at a given moment, he starts to consume cocaine and amphetamine and many other drugs. And then he has a breakdown and he decides to quit law. And then he decides to do a stand-up comedy show to elaborate on his previous life. So his stand-up presentation is a criticism to what he was living before. And at this moment, he's on the stage and speaking of the text that he presents at his stand-up gig. Well, it was the self-help writers, the neurolinguistic hacks, and the gurus of the corporate world who created this nonsense of avoiding the comfort zone. I didn't even know that this expression existed, comfort zone. And the first time I heard it, someone was informing me that I needed to avoid it. I took only a second to incorporate the voice of an affected guru. You. And that's my voice, okay? I am the affected guru, and you can imagine any other voice if you like. So the guru's voice is, you have to get out of your comfort zone, accept the challenges, embrace the risk, the imponderable. And then I resumed my own voice. First of all, if you live in Brazil, you are far from the comfort zone. It's as if the comfort zone was Japan on the other side of the world with 12 hours of time zone separating us. At that moment, demonstrations of approval took over the environment. And especially if you live in a favela in Rio de Janeiro, in the interior of the state of Tocantins, or in an indigenous reserve. In these places, it is easier for you to get shot than to take an X-ray exam. In fact, one thing that Brazilians need and urgently is to find their comfort zone. And once they find it, go in, sit on a couch, open a beer, and throw the key down the toilet. Well, I took a sip of water and waited for the audience to calm down. But leaving aside the socio-economic geographic aspect of the comfort zone, I still ask myself, why would anyone want to leave a comfortable zone to go to an uncomfortable zone? It doesn't make any sense. The zone is comfortable. Here, I modulated my voice to sound like a boring ant, one of those who respond to news anchors when they wish you good night. And again, the boring ant, you need to get out of your comfort zone to grow as a person, as a human being. And then I return to my persona. To grow as a person, grow as a human being. Do you know how you grow as a person and as a human being? Getting cheated on and seeing your team lose even when playing better. Applause, whistles, excited screams of support. I went ahead. Frank Sinatra released his best albums when Ava Gardner was hanging out with everyone and their brother. It was so much horn on his head that the poor guy's head looked like a seamstress's pillow, and the group that controlled inflation and created the Bolsa Familia cash transfer program was the same one that saw Paolo Rossi fill Valdir Perez's ass with goals in the 1982 World Cup.
Paolo Rossi. It was a long conversation during the lunch because we have two football fans here on the stage. Sandro Veronesi, take it away. The first thing that I should say is that I grew up in Prata, and it was Paolo Rossi's hometown in Tuscany, and we grew up together practically. Okay, I'm going to read an excerpt here, a chapter of this novel, which has just been released in Brazil, Black September, after which there's a surprise. If everything works, okay, I hope so. I'm going to give you a sign, okay? I had never heard a single note from Harry Belafonte's songs, but his name engaged me directly. Since I had one of his albums, it was one of the ones that Uncle Jati had given me as a present. And if the title was what I remembered, it was about something more than a mere coincidence, and I could not fail to show it to Astel. I did something typical of teenagers 16 years old. I told her to not fiddle with this, and I raced home. Fine, it was just to turn the corner, but it was necessary to do that in a spatial space-time definition, a parallel universe. At that time, it obeyed the categorical imperative of afternoon naps. And in fact, when I entered the bedroom, I woke Gilda up, who was napping, snoozing, and I made a huge mess until I found the album. And the title was what I remembered. So I raced back to Astel's home, racing back, shouting to my mother, bewildered, that everything was in order and we would see her on the beach later, as always. At the time, it was unimaginable to have that kind of a behavior in a 16-year-old kid. Afterwards, panting, I followed Astel to her room, accompanied by the eagle's eye of Primette, the cook, who had waited for me at the gate. Once in her bedroom, I gave her the album, and it was wrapped in a plain white envelope without any images or writing. That is why Astel did not know yet what it was all about. I asked her to close her eyes and to put the record on the record player without reading it, as if it were a game, and she obeyed, thinking it was fun. I myself didn't have the slightest idea of what we would hear, but we did know that it was a Harry Belafonte album. I knew that it had been a gift from Uncle Jati, and I knew that it was called Scarlet Ribbons. And this was sufficient for me and enough for me to feel literally dominated by a kind of, I don't know how to define it else, divine ecstasy. I didn't know anything, but I knew everything, okay? The album began to produce a crackling sound. The record had been played, I don't know how many times, who knows when, who knows where, over the course of I don't know how many years. But it was clear as the air that the most important recording that was for, it was the one that had just begun playing. Did you know this song before? I asked her. Asta opened her eyes again and shook her head. No. Did you like it? It's beautiful. Did you recognize who it is? No. It's Harry Belafonte. It's a song, a lullaby by Harry Belafonte, talking about a miracle. Once again, I learned and taught at the same time. A miracle, yes, in the lullaby. You want me to translate it for you? Can you? Of course I can. Isn't it? Illig, incomprehensible lyrics and irresistible groove, a way to talk about incomprehensible lyrics and irresistible groove, which are the songs whose lyrics you can't understand, even if they're enjoyable. Isn't it illig? Not at all. I put the record on the record player and I began to whisper into her ear the translation in Italian of what Belafonte was singing. The first translation, truly important, of this that I made in my life. I peeked in to say goodnight. When I heard my child in prayer, and for me, some scarlet ribbons for my hair. All our stores were closed and shuttered. All the streets were dark and bare. In our town, no scarlet ribbons for her hair. Through the night, my heart was aching. Just before the dawn was breaking, I peeked in again, and on her bed, in gay profusion lying there, lovely ribbons, scarlet ribbons for her hair. If I live to be 100, I will never know from where. Came those lovely scarlet ribbons. Scarlet ribbons for her hair. I didn't kiss her, not even this time, but I touched her hair. For the first time, I touched her braids, her wonderful braids, elastic, warm, compact, and soft at the same time, scintillating under the light, dark like black onyx and decorated with colored ribbons. It's difficult to describe the feeling of rapture from that contact, because now, as I write, I'm far away from there. At height, it would be like to describe a balloon which escaped from a child's hand as it disappears into the blue sky. Neither did she kiss me. She did not touch my hair either. She touched my hair, but for her, it was not the first time.
Thank you very much for the readings, and we are now minimally acquainted with the narrators and characters, and I think that we are more prepared to continue with our conversation. Our roundtable is named The Extraordinary Ordinary Life because it is a point of contact between your works and who tell us about this daily life. And in your book, Sandro, in your books, Sandro, we see it very strongly. I was part of many reading groups around the hummingbird, and very often people say something about making extraordinary the ordinary life of people. And maybe I was influenced by a group in which I am part, which is conducted by William Fuchs. He dedicated one of our meetings to talk about the hummingbird, and I am not capable of not thinking that maybe Marco Carrera's life in the hummingbird is nothing ordinary, because he was the psychologist of his wives, talks to him to tell him that he's in danger, and then many other points of contact arise in your books. And I would like to understand, where is the line that separates ordinary from extraordinary, and where can things reverse their sense and then extraordinary becomes ordinary and the opposite? Well, the difference is in the fact that people are almost all of them ordinary to the eyes of other people. It is difficult nowadays to think of the other as someone extraordinary unless you know them, unless you know that they are extraordinary. But for instance, and I don't want to hurt anyone, but I knew very well that Paolo Rossi was extraordinary when I was young, and everyone said that he was great. So it was easy to say that it wasn't an ordinary person in his case. But leaving him aside, I would say that I knew many ordinary people, and what's not ordinary is the life of those people, because the lives of each of us is full of losses and mourning and happiness, and having a child is a great joy, but it's something ordinary, it's something common also. And to a certain point in the history of literature, there was no name for this. There was no place for this, because we would write books about heroes and great military people and noble people, and books about things that had nothing to do with the ordinary life of ordinary people, and they didn't even they couldn't even read those books. And then after this mass education and literacy, then the people started reading more books, and literature started to talk about no longer about the aristocracy and the military, but about ordinary people and the bourgeoisie at the time. So they were ordinary people when compared to heroes in the narrative and in poems from previous centuries. But there was a moment in 1939, a moment at which ordinary people, they came into literature through the door of tragedy, because it was the ode to the unknown citizen, written by Auden in 1939. And this poem, which is the portrait of an ordinary man, of his life, his insurance policy, and the fact that he's saving money to send his kids to school, ordinary things. It was actually tragic, and it's a wonderful poem that says, look, there is no worst tragedy than the one that affects an ordinary life, that devours an ordinary life. And in fact, after that moment, after the wars, there was no more competition, because almost every novel written in Europe and in North America, but also in South America, started to talk about ordinary people. Of course, that the facts that were told, the stories, were not ordinary. They were many times related, intertwined with history with a capital H, and they continued being ordinary people. They could be a neighbor or a relative or something, or yourself. And literature took centuries to do this shift, because in the past only exceptional people were the object of literature. And I arrived at the end of this process. Of course, I followed all the trajectory of literature before me, but I had no doubt that Auden was right. The 20th century was the century of ordinary people. And also, there was no question that I needed to talk about ordinary people, just like myself. People that carry in themselves stories that are sometimes terrible, sometimes very enthusiastic, or sometimes it's just about a traffic discussion, or some argument on the line to the movie theater. So people that play their role as we play our role. Like, we are almost all of us ordinary people because almost all of us do the same things more or less. And what happens to us is that we don't know how to convey it. There is a moment in Marco Carrera's story in The Hummingbird where something extraordinary takes place, but he is not capable of transforming it into art. Apart from being an ophthalmologist, the only thing that he can do is to stand it and this is what I'm interested in. It's well, acceptance, the fact that in spite of loss and whatever hit you, you were able to give a step forward and another one. It's been like 20 years in which I write novels preceded by a Samuel Beckett quote. It's always the same quote, the same sentence by Beckett, which is, I can't move on. Stop. I will continue. Stop. That's the heroic attitude that I want to see.
This protagonist, the narrator in your book, Nilo, is a very peculiar man and very different, I would say, from average Brazilians, although he's similar to a lot of Brazilians, but he doesn't look like most of Brazil, because in his book we know a little about where he came from. He says he came from a privileged place. He went to an elite university. He attended there an elite office. He doesn't even know doesn't have to make huge effort to reach that law office. And so perhaps that's the reason that much of what happens with him, for me, all the time, is extraordinary. Everything is outside the curve because he makes uncommon choices. When we make these social cross sections, do you think it's possible to find a common ordinary and a common extraordinary? If we take tragedy as the point of departure, we have tragedies so different. Each of us live different tragedies, and we have common tragedies with people that look like us, but our differences. Is it possible to find the ordinary and the extraordinary that draw us closer together? Of course, yes. He has a life, Nilo, through an extraordinary angle, but I think that his motivation is common to a lot of people. It's common to a lot of people. I think that's cool because no matter how much we may have, we have different points of view. We've come from different places. Nevertheless, we have some things which connect us, which are, we like to be loved, we like to love, we like to make it in life. We're afraid. Most people want to have children or not have children. In other words, there's this kind of language which is common to each person. What happens with Nilo, my character, is in fact that he has his motivations, that everything that the people may report. There's a point which is something at the beginning, which is there are things that are allowed for certain segments of people or social classes, right? They're allowed for those segments. So the fact that you work in a big law office or law firm in the middle of a lot of wealthy people, it allows you to access some things that other people don't have access to. Or you can dream with things that other people cannot dream of. He has a bigger ambition. I want to have my name on a building on the Faria Lima Avenue, which is easier to be accessed by him than by somebody who was born in the hinterlands of Tocantins in the boondocks of Brazil. So I think that there is a common language that people understand because of this history, that the story that everybody has access to reading. People have access to movies and films, have access to a common alphabet, right? But There are some things that are only allowed for certain segments of human beings, and others are prevented. The cover flap presents Nilo as an anti-hero, and I've heard comments concerning the book that also talk about him as an anti-hero. What makes him an anti-hero? Why isn't he a hero? I think actually the hero doesn't exist. If you come close and put a magnifying glass on heroes, I think no heroes actually exist. They're all anti-heroes. There's no heroic perfection. He's an anti-hero because he's imperfect, and people also, even a certain kind of rejection. It's a strong, or disgust. They suspect Nilo. It's curious that the day a friend of mine said, I hated Nilo, I said, dude, you hate half of me, in other words, because I used a major portion of myself to be able to write this dude here, the character. So I think that the anti-hero is exactly this. He does things that are reproachable, things that are not, let's say, worthy of praise. This makes him an anti-hero, I believe, okay? Something that I consider heroic is deceleration, and I thought it actually, we didn't know what each person was going to read or what the choices for readings. I think it's heroic, Sandro, for you to have chosen to read, translating it while the song was playing, to wait for the tempo of the song to reach the end of these pages with the tempo that things need. And I think that acceleration may be a huge challenge, but also for literature, not only because acceleration has to do with the time that we dedicate to readings, but because we need to find time for the words in the books, right? I would like to ask you how do you choose the time of the words, or the pace, the tempo? There's a modulation of the language in your books for it to accelerate and decelerate according to what is happening. There are moments when they're very rapid moments because the characters are entering into inner abysses, and you enter together with them in the inner abysses, and they're very slow times, and life also almost comes to a standstill. How do you choose the language to build the velocity or the speed in your books? Well, I'm not very worried about acceleration. I'm worried about traction. That's what interests me. That's what I care about. That's what I care for. It's an issue of attitude. I'll give you an example. When you drive, not in a highway, just any ordinary street, a street with ups and downs, curves, do you always drive at the same speed? You decide ahead of time where you have to accelerate and decelerate? No. It's something that you decide on the spot when it happens. As it happens, you have to accelerate or reduce the gas according to the terrain, the potholes, and what you can see on the road, and the advantage that you have in a given curve to feel the centrifugal force in your stomach, and that desire passes and you decrease the speed. In life, you maintain always the same time. No, but it's not true that you don't decide ahead of time how to change. So when I write a novel, I want the novel to drag to the end. I like this traction. The words have to be dragged. Of course, the words have to be well chosen. They have to have that traction. And to drag, to pull, it requires going more slowly to go more slowly. If you have to go faster, we speed up. But I don't think much about that, just as I don't think when I drive, if I'm going to accelerate now or not. But the issue of time that you mentioned here, that you brought up, is a huge issue, because in fact, when we write a novel, which is a convention, right? A novel is one of the most powerful conventions. The reader has to believe not only in the events, but has to believe as well that what he is reading is important. Otherwise he's going to prefer to do something else. The convention is that the way, since there were so many grand novels and masterpieces, you think perhaps this, the one in my hands, may be worthwhile. That's a convention already, but there's the time. Time has several different levels. There's several different times or tempos that you have to control. First and foremost, there's the time that I have available to write, which is always a problem, okay? Because there's never enough time, right? When there's too much time, it's too much, and you waste time. I spent periods of my life where I had nothing more to do except write, and I wrote very little. And sometimes you have little time, but you're in a productive moment, so that those few hours produce a lot, and they yield a lot, but that's your time. It's a time that you take to write, the time which you take to finish your work. For me, it takes years. I take at least 3 years to write a novel, okay? 2.5 years. It happened, a miracle with Black September, 2.5 years. Normally it's at least 3 years. So it's a time that has to be administered and managed together with other things. Then there's the time of the narrative. You go through a time period which is that of the hummingbird, an entire life, and in Black September, just a few months. So this time does not coincide with my own time. It's a different time. It's a time of the characters. And then there's the time that the reader takes to read the novel. And this is also not only how long it takes to read the entire book, because it can take 1 day, an evening, or a month. But the time that he takes to read a certain page, a certain phrase, a sentence, you want him to accelerate, but it's not you that accelerates, it's the reader that has to speed up. Because if you accelerate and he doesn't follow you, he's not going to understand. His time is extremely important, the reader's time. Because both myself who is writing and he who is reading, or she, we can be disturbed at any moment or interrupted. All this construct. If the telephone rings, your kid broke his ankle, you interrupt a phrase for weeks, as happened with me, for example. I hadn't even finished the sentence. My kid broke his ankle. I had to solve my kid's ankle. Then I finished the sentence later. I no longer remember even what the phrase was, or the sentence. That fractured ankle and the phrase we hid quite well. My kid's ankle, he hid the fracture as well, but there was a time there in the middle of all that between the subject and the predicate. It took 2 weeks, and I had to hide, but 2 weeks went by. I had to hide that hiatus in those 2 weeks. If the war broke out between Russia and Ukraine, I would have finished the phrase in a different world, as can happen. So administration of these times becomes impossible to control acceleration, what you called acceleration. I can only attempt to suggest to readers to accelerate, because if, for example, this is a kind of technicism. I didn't invent this myself, but with the readers I learned that if you take the punctuation out and the commas, you can read faster. Of course, you're going to slide through as if I were reading with the brakes off and pummeling down the street, because the period allows me to breathe. So I'm going to try for the brakes and the gear shift to gear down. You either abandon, give up. This is too complicated. I don't want to collaborate with this kind of crazy writing. And I can accelerate as much as I want, but the reader will be left behind, or he accelerates just because I turn the steering wheel with the plane. I incline it because I feel the need. I tilt the plane. I'm not thinking about the reader who's going to speed up, because if I did that, I would be wrong. I only think of tilting the plane because at that point, the plane has to be inclined, an inclined plane. I can't explain why, but sometimes I realize that it's not good like that, and I cancel everything. I erase it. These are decisions taken on the spot. The command over time and the control over time is impossible. So, to try to manage as if it were possible to control, it's a waste of time. We can only trust in the convention. Readers are going to follow you. The reader is your accomplice. He's the author. This has been said before in the 1970s. And Umberto Eco, the reader is the author, right? And you have to trust the reader. It's a kind of complicity that you have to win the reader. The reader has to like what he's reading, and if he likes what he's reading, it's the greatest, a formidable accomplice, greater than culture sensitivity, much more than yours, because what is not yours and flows for your work is the true gift, the aid, the force that can take a book, a work, a literary work of any kind outside the ordinary. It's what the reader puts into it. It's what the readers put into the reading that makes it an incredible book. Pedro, do you think that this narrative of the emotions, does it help you to do this modulation of the time? Nilo has a time where we almost take a smoothie with him. We drink the smoothie with him, but at other moments he slows down in this deceleration. In Nilo, it has a lot to do that when he starts using humor, it's if he turned the effective key, in a sense. Do you understand? It's in his subjectivity, this time, that this time, internal time, is indissociable from the external time. There is this reading. It's what I wanted to do, actually, what I meant to do. The book has two different halves. The first half, he in his law office, law firm, and going crazy. And I wanted it to be fast in the sense that it reflects his state of spirit. Obviously, it was not something millimetrically conceived, but I was imbued with his spirit. And as Veronesi just said, it was something which it had to be done there. So I think that things occurred faster, and he was more, it was almost like the motor force. He went like the engine. When he turned the key, he began to do stand-up comedy. The comedy and humor served as a kind of medicine, almost like a protection that he had to use against a way of living that he learned. He was encouraged to live that way, and his prior life in the law office. And so, yes, the two halves of the book are two separate books almost. And it's based on that. I wanted to have focused attention to exalt the way, almost psychotic way that he lived in the second half, a kind of elaboration on the psychotic form, the way of living, a humorous approach to his previous way of living, almost as a drug for his life, which was so helter-skelter, and he faced now a normal life. But reading the book, we understand that it's not all that simple, but that was the basic idea. Your part in Nilo is the funny part, the humorous part. I think it's the funny part, the obsessed part of obsession as well. And both parts, a lot of both parts, although I go far from auto-fiction, especially the part in the breakdown. So it's not really self-fiction. And his breakdown, he freaked out, in other words. It's kind of real and self-fictional that I experienced that myself at that moment when he freaked out. But a major part of, it's not a complete self-fiction. You talked about the time and the characters. I would like to insist on this thing of time, to be able to think on this issue of emotion. If emotion gives you this time, I was thinking to myself, for example, in the strategies for language, and there's a moment in Black September, there's a dialogue where the father and mother are in dialogue, and the dialogue begins with short phrases as if they were in a ping-pong game, ping-pong back and forth, ping-ponging back and forth. In the Hummingbird, you have changes of speed. And the word, I'm going to use this metaphor from, it was speed, right, or velocity. You have changes based on who is telling that part. The narrator, for example, who is ironic, somewhat funny, he has a time, And Mark is melancholic when he writes. Marco, we recognize his face when he writes letter. He has another time or tempo. What do emotions have to do with this construction of time?
Well, once again, I have to say that the only actual emotions that exist in a book are the emotions of the reader. Of course, the writers, when he or she writes, but as Pedro said today when we met, and I was attracted by him because he looks like Osvaldo Soriano, a young version of Osvaldo Soriano. I knew him. He had this beautiful face, and he said something to me. He said, "It never happened, but I cried when reading The Hummingbird." Maybe someone could say, "Oh no, I don't want anyone to cry," but the emotion was brought by him. That's the emotion that counts. It happened to me already that I was crying when I was writing, but this doesn't count because if I am going to write and I am writing, well, it's not that I wanted it to happen. It happened out of itself because of a sentence that I read, and it also happened once that I cried in front of the audience when I was introducing another author, when I was reading a page of his book, which was very moving to me. And I had prepared myself and I took notes. But when I got there, I started crying and I had to stop reading. And the author needed to touch my shoulder and help me calm down, and at that point something was happening to me and I was sad, and then a sad page at a moment of great sadness moves you much more than other moments of joy, for instance, of satisfaction. So I repeat, what makes a work something that goes beyond the measure that can be done by the best critic is the reader's emotion. I've never seen anyone reading one of my books. I cannot be there observing whether they're going to smile or laugh or cry. So when I finish writing my book, the book doesn't belong to me anymore. I have the author's right, but that from that moment on, the book belongs to those that are reading it. And if it's like many people that read it or a few people that read it, well, the emotion that counts is the reader's emotion. Sometimes an emotion arises unpredictably. Sometimes it is something that you were not expecting, and there is something else which is very important that I learned over time. Many times, any story that I would write, because I changed many times, and when you are signing your books, there is always someone, a man, women, sometimes more than one people that say, "You were telling my story, that's my story." And sometimes it's a tragic story, and I'm sad for them. And so, oh my God, this person went through what Marco Carrera went. So I'm so sorry. But is it possible that I invent a story and someone comes and tells me, well, it's my story? But that's because those people, I don't know that before, but those people had already been hit by that emotion. And so you help the emotions to come to the surface. And if they like what you wrote, they are comforted by what you wrote. And I heard things that I couldn't even believe. They were reading The Hummingbird, and when I was like signing the book, they said to me that I helped them very much. And I was like It's not possible. They were helping themselves with the book. What could I do? I didn't do anything. Well, but not on purpose. I wrote something that maybe they shouldn't read, but they read, and instead of hitting me, which wouldn't be right because I didn't do it on purpose, someone came to the point of saying to me that I helped them. But I would never have thought of this emotion that is given like that because someone takes it like that. It's very difficult to manage time, speaking of acceleration or speed, managing things that other people are going to experiment or to leave. So I try to be out of myself. I do the opposite of autofiction because I do like auto imagination. I throw myself into the characters that are not myself, that have a different life from mine. And I always remember, which is, by the way, another sentence that I carry around and that I use as much as Beckett's. It's something that I have always with me from an Italian poet named Emilio De Angelis, one of the greatest poets in the world. It is a great poet in Italy, but I think he's a global poet. And in one of his verses, he says more or less something like that. If someone asked back what is not mine, there would be nothing left. And that's what I'm interested in. Everything that's not mine, I put into the books and then I ask it back and there is nothing left. Can I say something very quickly? I would like to congratulate the interpreter Rafaela because she has a speed that usually interpreters in simultaneous, they are very anxious and they're late and they start running, but she is perfect. It's very much like she is the one lecturing, and I can say that I've heard her translating you. I can say that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sandro, I would like to ask you how much do you believe in words as a representation? And I am going to explain why I'm asking this question. In The Hummingbird, in the beginning of the book, the narrator starts saying that the story takes place in Trieste, but it's useless to explain more because the story is going to change. And then further ahead, the narrator Marco says that he cannot let go of objects because they are a proof of her life and a possibility of capturing the past. And then we, the readers, we have the impression that permanence is in the objects and not in the words. And then I had the feeling that there was a conflict between the narrator and Marco because the narrator was not believing in in the words as permanence, and Marco was taking the objects of which from which he cannot separate himself, and then he starts to make a kind of inventory, like he's transforming objects into words. And the first time I read it, I thought it was a very interesting conflict around impermanence and what is the thing that makes impermanence possible, objects or words. And then later it looked to me that it was something about the words and the paradox around words, that words are not the objects and they will never be the objects, but they are our best chance of representing the object. So I would like to ask you how much you believe in words as representation. If you had to take a side in this conflict between Marco and the narrator, what side would you take? Well, I'm on the side of words because I'm a writer, and I copy the craftsman's way of doing thing. I have already studied architecture, and I copied the way they work. I assimilated it, and I've learned how to make objects, but I transform in my mind everything that I've learned to do into words, but I need to say something. Writing. Where does it come from? Well, of course, it became entertainment, a matter of telling a story, and very importantly, recording our cultures and civilizations. And there are many stories, so that the stories would remain in a certain way without being lost. They were written into papers. So the Gospels, they existed for 2-3 decades only orally. They were preached, and there were theme sessions in which they could preach or not. But and then there was Marcus and Matthew and Luke, and they organized those thematic sections into texts, and they are different texts because the Gospels are different, but they tell the same story, and they wrote it down so that it wouldn't change over time, so that the preacher would not change it or forget the facts. But writing is born as a testament. It is born on funeral stones. So here lay someone, here lies someone, so and so, and I am. And speaking of funeral stele, in which, well, sometimes they found statues and some inscriptions on at the bases of the statue, and in time, they would be broken, and sometimes you could not find all of their parts, only the inscription, only the pieces of the statue. Whereas in the case of Sophicleia, it has been preserved in an incredible way. There is even color, and it is a funeral inscription, just to make in such a way that we remember this young girl. And I am, after 2,700 years, talking about her. And this is the power of words. The only weak thing is that the word was in the object, and in the object was almost lost. But since the word became replicable, and by printing, the printing press, and the power of a word is this perennial character, the possibility of not degrading. The objects may have a glorious life, like those from the hummingbirds list, but a time comes in which they no longer work. And there is a given moment in which you have this problem in the Odyssey. You have to describe the Olympus, and so the abode of gods, and you cannot offend them by describing their abode and describing it as an object with the most beautiful marble in the world or any other material used, and after some millennia nothing would remain, only dust, but they are immortal. So they decided to use words. The author, when describing the Olympus, which is a place in which there is never a rain or snow or winds. So with the words, he removes the need of having an object. So if the weather is perfect, what need would you have of a house? You are in the nature, and Homer is very intelligent, very smart when he does this, because there was this conflict of having to write about an object that could not deteriorate because it belonged to the gods, and so he used words, and that's the power of words. But because the objects have a brief life, they may well last for some centuries, but not forever. And I work with words, and I'm full of words, mine and others, but I love the objects more than the words because I am moved by their life. They're very much like a pet that lives for 13 years. An object overlives me, but when I buy something, I already see that object a little bit broken, but I will be dead, but the object will wear and tear in time. But when it comes to words, they will exist forever, even in 1,000 years. You said in a recent interview that more than a writer, you are a character creator. And then quickly you rephrased it and you said, oh no, but I like also this thing of writing a word after another. So what is the strength of characters and why are they so important to you? I think that the character is the link you establish with the reader. The character is a way of making in such a way that readers, they relate to the book. And that's why I am more about characters and a character writer, even though I like to link the words like subject and predicate and etc. But when I link with the character, when the writers not only they instill life in characters, but they bring their own life to characters, and they sometimes even kidnap those characters. And I'm very impressed with the capacity people have to use characters to be part of their lives. Like, for instance, Sandro just mentioned that, oh, you were writing about my life. I lived the same experience. No, it's the characters, but you are relating to it. Sometimes people come to me and say, oh, this character you wrote about is me. And I said, well, okay, great. I wasn't thinking of it, but if you took the character to you, well, we offer the character to people and they do whatever they like with the characters. So I think that the power of literature, at least the literature that I like to do and that I know how to do, is in creating characters. And what's very incredible is when you create characters, you think, oh, this character is going to do this and that. But at a given moment, the character is no longer what you were deciding. They go after their own life. It looks like I'm kidding, but it's very impressive to see how much characters are capable of leading authors to write what they are writing, and not the opposite, like writers writing the life of characters the way they want. In my experience, I see characters writing themselves and making the authors follow them on the path, not the opposite. It's very much like the proof of the power of characters when they have their own life, their own light, and they're capable of doing it. And they are capable of directing me towards whatever they want me to write. Yes, we were talking earlier, and one of the things that we were saying is that sometimes the readers want to know more about the characters, and the writers, they don't know. And sometimes readers ask, what happened to this person or that person? I don't know. I know only what's there in the book. Yes, and that's very funny because we, in the Maior Ser Humano Vivo, the biggest human being alive, well, there's a book and then there is a full stop, and that's the end of the book. But people want to know, okay, but after the end of the book, what happens? I don't know. I finished the book. But aren't they going to do this and that? Aren't they going to date such and such person? I don't know. It may happen, but I was not the person who decided it. You can create it in your mind. You can create the continuation of a story, but I did not create it. And sometimes people ask, are you going to write the second part of what? The book? But it is a full part. There's no second part. Yeah, okay, but what's going to happen later to such and such character? I don't know, but you can imagine whatever you like. Be my guest and then send it to me later because I would love to know. Yes, and during lunchtime, Sandro was telling us a very nice uh, story. There is a Newen McEwen book, The Child in Time, and it's a child that disappears and no one finds it. And Sandro said that there is a not very well-known writer in Italy that wrote a book about what happened to the child. And when this author told it to Ewan McEwen, McEwen was really interested in knowing what happened to the child because he really wanted to know. That's very interesting. I think that characters also have something that allow us to address some topics. The story of characters allow us to address some topics even when the book is not about the same topic. And I thought about some questions, and during the first roundtable, Tasso de Mello quoted Italo Calvino mentioning that the writer in a sentence needs to represent like time, and in your work many times time is very captured by news, political events, and etc. How much is this important to you, Pedro? Well, it's curious because I think those are two ways of seeing what happens in time, at least for me. I read the two books by Sandro, and I think that he's very clear in what he says in the books, whereas mine is a little bit cynical and ironic, sometimes too much. And so there is a difference because he writes with a lot of clarity, and things are whatever they are telling us, or in my point of view. And for me, this cynicism or this irony comes from the pressure that we feel, even though the characters are ordinary characters, even mundane. In my book, they suffer very much from the burden of reality hovering over their head. And they are people to answer to this reality. In my case, Nilo is someone very much obsessed with the idea of success, obsessed with the idea of being successful and earning a lot of money, which I think is part of this reality that oppresses him and that teaches him how to behave this way. You need to behave this way because that's how things go. And I think that there is this burden on him. And what was the question again? And how much this is important, this, and if it weren't for what's happening, there would be no book. But it's very curious because when I read Sandro's books, and I've just read Black September, Luigi Baldini, which is the main character, which is a boy, he is under the pressure of what's happening in the world, not only around him, but what he sees on TV and etc. And my character, Nilo, also feels the pressure, but differently, without the pressure put by society, the pressure that says that people need to be successful to the point that they enslave themselves so that they reach a given objective. The book wouldn't exist, and maybe I wouldn't write it because I feel kind of a fear, not a fear, but I am sometimes very much astonished by the reality and how much things that happen around the world impose or pose some pressure on ordinary people's lives. In my first book, the backdrop of the story, and many times it's not a backdrop because it may fall over characters, were the June 2013 protests. And in this book, The Greatest Human Being, Living Human Being, well, I talk about the way people spend their own life enslaving themselves to move forward, and it's also a backdrop that falls over the characters. And I think that I don't even know if I am capable of writing something that doesn't bring this heavy, like dense substance that falls over the characters. Maybe I am capable of doing it, but I wasn't interested in doing it yet. As Italo Calvino said, uh, I, I don't know if it is mandatory to write about time, but I feel this need now to write about time, even though time is not uh, the main point of the novel, but it operates malignant things on people.
Sandro, psychoanalysis has appeared in contemporary literature, not exactly something new, but it's been a strong presence. Psychoanalysis between literature and psychoanalysis. And I think that there's something funny in The Hummingbird, which is Marco Carreira being averse to psychoanalysis, and he creates passive psychoanalysis. He talks about passive psychoanalysis as if it doesn't suffice to not want to do psychoanalysis. You have to hate psychoanalysis and to not be like people that do therapy. How much is it a source for you? Why do you think that this encounter has been so prolific between literature and psychoanalysis? This is exactly one of the cases where I project myself out of myself because I have done psychoanalysis or therapy for almost 30 years. It's essential for me, not so much to console myself when I'm not well, but as an experience, as an alternative way of adhering to things. Of course, there is psychoanalysis and psychoanalyst, which psychoanalysis per se combines all of the psychoanalysis, past, present, and future, and all the patients as well. It's like a bubble. And psychoanalysis. So it's what occupied the place. That's why it's so present in literature, at least in the Western world, in our Western world. It's taken the place of philosophy. If you stop to think in the 19th century, philosophers inspired and filled the pages of the narrators of the great writers until the early 20th century. Philosophy was the main source for writers. Afterwards, precisely in the late 19th century, there exploded psychoanalysis, which put philosophy into a crisis because it invented something that philosophy had overlooked. In other words, that spark, maddening spark, self, each person's self, because each person found is uncontrollable. So solid, granitic in that sense. My monumental works, which is philosophy, was replaced by a practice with all of the egos of the world, which became the protagonist because Freud became a substance which multiplies the id or ego. So talking about common men, talking about what is ordinary person who has a ego and id, that entire universe which is inside each of us. The ego, the id, and it's not philosophy, it's science. It's something that is studied. Your world studied all the disorders. Each disorder is different. And this replaced the studies of philosophy. Now the studies of philosophy are that of the history of philosophy. The philosophers, contemporary ones, are historians of philosophy. They know a lot precisely because they penetrate into and possess the philosophy of the past. But a philosopher, Heidegger was the last one who said something new, Heidegger. He said something that disturbs people, while Freud and Jung, even Lacan, just to cite the big names, they told a lot of disturbing things, and these disturbing things relate to all of us. Disturbing things, you don't have to be erudite. It's unpleasant as a practice, of course, because a person who does not do psychoanalysis, like Marco Carrera, for example, or Zeno Cozzini, the character of the book of 100 years ago, Zeno's conscience. My son was named Zeno as a tribute to this great Italian novelist. He's passive psychoanalysis 100 years ago. Zeitgeist. It's the novelty taking us to talk about psychoanalysis. Today, it's easy. He told us, he said this in 1925 when that was still, it was far from being affirmed. Jung was still alive. Jung. It was a time when you were talking about something new in psychoanalysis, and there as well, there's an irony of a character who is surrounded by psychoanalysis and without doing psychoanalysis himself or therapy. Well, I dove in practice into it, into a study and the reading of the works of the great psychoanalysts, no longer for my own benefit to cure myself, because there's a horizon which compensates me for the loss of philosophy. So for me, psychoanalysis is essential. It's essential in the life of a person, minimally aware and educated. I chose one who I would not say I hate him, but it bothers me. But everyone, and all of the women especially, in her life do an analysis, and he says, they're going to be badmouth me, right? He thought to himself. Psychoanalysis and philosophy are for us to look to answers for the characters that look for them. Freedom and truth. Do you think that literature, for us to finish, can be a field of dispute for freedom and truth? I'll give you an answer, which is not about what is written there. Truth, it's the truth of what I think. Yes, that's my answer. Yes. Everything that you could add to that, it's true. What you say is true, in my view. So, since time is over, I'll stop there. I'm going to end with a question for you, Pedro, with a challenge to be short, with a short answer, because Nilo is a anguished character since he repeats the patterns. We want him to break the patterns. He repeats and repeats and repeats the patterns, and suddenly he sees himself, because of this repetition, in a crossroads with discourses of resistance to the system, imposed to the impossibility of doing this, making this discourse without using the system, making the discourse reach more people. This is an issue in many fields. Do you think it's possible to think of a kind of literature which never capitulates, that never negotiates, never caves in? I think so. That's why we need to write and continue to write. That's the point, right? I love the brief answer, the brevity of your optimism. So thank you very much. So concise and to the point.